Hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started on the second set of evolution notes here. Evolution intro and evidence. We're going to start getting into how how the thoughts of evolution started coming about and look at the beginnings of some evidence. So, a lot of questions started being asked around Darwin's time and even before Darwin's time, such as had life always existed as it does now? Were living things changing? How old was the Earth? Um, and something called empirical thought began to be more common. And that's really what that means is kind of like our state logo, the show me state. In Missouri, we don't just take your word for it, you have to show me. And so that's really kind of the basis for this, too. Um, People were looking at observation, they were trying to understand, and they were asking why and how, and they were starting to not just take people's word for it. They wanted to see the evidence and see for themselves why things were what they were. So it kind of started changing how people thought about things around these times. So a couple of the pioneers leading up to Darwin, John Ray began classifying plants and animals in the 1600s, and he noted that no species mated with another species. So that may seem obvious to us. Back then, people were just becoming accustomed to looking at the world in these ways. So Carolus Linnaeus, hopefully you've heard his name before. He came up with a system of binomial nomenclature. And if you break that down, binomial means two names. Um, so this is the system that we use to name things in science with all of the Latin words that we use. So for humans, it would be Homo sapiens. So it's the genus species system of naming things, and that would be from Linnaeus. Um, George Buffon, he was a French zoologist, and he noted that living things change through time. So he was kind of on board with things do change, but he wouldn't commit saying that like evolution was really happening and that things evolved one thing into another and stuff like that. So he was getting there, but wasn't quite either. He didn't know completely, or he was just unwilling to go there. Thomas Malthus is one of the interesting guys, I think, because he was an economist. He wasn't a biology guy. And he published an essay on why populations don't just keep growing. Like, why, as an economics guy, you're looking at how many people there are and what's the demand and, how things go on food supplies and stuff like that. And so, basically it said that populations would love to grow continuously, but they can't. Well, why, back in, almost 1800, why couldn't populations grow continuously back then? Well, you had disease, and famine, and war, and sanitation wasn't great back then. Even labor, child labor, like birthing a child, mother or baby wouldn't always make it. One or the other wouldn't always make it. And so you end up with some population graphs like this, where if we look at some of the lines over here, you can see the dotted line that's going straight up this way, and that's an exponential growth. Okay, it's called the J curve. And then you have this green line here that is actually called more of an S curve. And then you have the flat line right here, which the green line kind of touches. And what's really going on there, I shouldn't have put my pen away. What's really going on there is this line, this flat line over here. I'm going to put a couple C's here because that stands for carrying capacity. So if you remember from regular biology, when you did the ecology unit, you would have seen carrying capacity. So man, this does this every now and then where I can't put my pen away, but then I can't click forward either. So let me, here, there we go. So I think I got out of that. So um, anyway, populations can't just grow continuously because things slow them down, right? And so there's carrying capacity, there's limits on what it could be. Now, we're doing a pretty good job at pushing our population quite high, and maybe we're going to find out what the carrying capacity is of our planet at some point because the population when I was much younger was about half of what it is now, and that's in my own lifetime. In my lifetime, the planet population has about doubled. If it doubles in your lifetime, I think you're going to see some stress for sure on the system. So we'll see. We'll talk about that more in ecology. Um, if you look at the next guy, Cuvier, George Cuvier, another French guy, he proposed catastrophism, which, it's for catastrophes. So he really thought that the Earth was just changed by a really few large events. over time, because he was noting, well, not everything that's been around on the earth is around today. The dinosaurs are gone, but they knew of dinosaur fossils back then. And so, why do species go extinct? Does God just get tired of some species? That's what, they were starting to ask these questions, like, why do things change like this? How does this go? Hutton and Lyell came up with the idea of uniformitarianism. It's a little bit of the opposite of catastrophism, where this is saying, well, we just think they're small changes and that they happen all the time, but we don't always notice them because we don't live long enough to notice them. But the Earth is constantly changing, and it's been changing in the past, and it's going to change in the future, and it's changing right now. And it's hard for us to see because humans are on the planet very long. And even back then, life expectancy was much shorter than it is now. And so it was difficult to see, but they believe that all these small changes are what make things kind of happen over time. And then we get to Lamarck. Lamarck, it's very easy to confuse Lamarck and Darwin's ideas. They're very similar as far as he said life evolves and things happen, but he didn't quite have the correct mechanism. So he proposed the inheritance of acquired characteristics, meaning you inherit traits from your parents, and if they acquired a trait during their lifetime, they could pass it on. And this is the part that wasn't quite accurate. So he believed that a giraffe stretching for leaves its whole life would actually get a longer neck. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. Because if that was the case, then I would make myself 6 foot tall. So, I would spend my days stretching and make myself taller, but we can't do that. And nor can giraffes or anything else. We're kind of born with what we got. And if we got a change that was beneficial, we can pass that change on. And so the species can evolve over time, but an individual really can't. And so that's the real difference from between Lamarck and Darwin. So we go to Darwin, but not Charles Darwin. This is Erasmus Darwin. This was Charles' grandfather, and he was very much in tune with how things went. And he had a lot of great ideas about life and biology, being a physician and a plant biologist and a poet. He wrote a few books. Here's a really long excerpt of one, and I'm not going to read that to you, but if you read through this, you can see how Charles Darwin might have kind of had it in his blood to look at these questions, because his grandfather was already looking at these questions. So, he was already trying to figure out how life happened. And so pretty interesting to see that lineage from him. So Charles had a relatively boring childhood. His family did have a lot of money. He was undecided what to do. He was kind of floundering around, didn't know what to do, and so he got a spot on the HMS Beagle, and the Beagle was the ship that was going to go around the globe, and it was actually going to be on a cartography mission, mapping more of the globe and trying to figure out more things about the globe. And he was along as the ship's naturalist. By the way, HMS Beagle, that stands for Her Majesty's Ship. And so that is actually a thing they still do today, how they name their naval ships in Britain. So the trip took 5 years. He started when he was 22 years old, so he didn't get back till he was 27. So half of his 20s were spent on this boat and visiting all of these different places. And he collected and he wrote and he read and he thought. And here's kind of a map of the trip, and I'll kind of dot it out for you so you can see, because it's kind of hard to follow the arrows. So they start up here in England. Where'd my green dot go? It's not really. Oh, it's because it's so tiny. Let's try this. There we go. So they started up here in England, and they came down the coast here, touched on Africa, and then came all the way across and landed on South America. Went around the tip of South America, and then here's the Galapagos. This is where he had his aha moment. This is where he really came up with a lot of questions and saw a lot of things that started getting him thinking about how things must have gone. And I'll come back to this in a minute in the next couple slides. So from the Galapagos over to Tahiti, and then to the other side over here, Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia, around the tip of Africa, back to South America, and then finally back home to England. Okay, so pretty long trip. So in the Galapagos, he noticed there were some differences, some things that didn't look like other places. And so for one, he found lizards that were swimming, and he said those are the only ones he ever saw in the world. There were some marine iguanas there swimming in the ocean, and that was different. And so he also looked at tortoises, one species with many different shells based on the type of cactus found in the area. So different islands had different type of cactus, and then the tortoises developed different shells based on that. And so, why would that be? Why would tortoises be different from one island to another? Like, that's so crazy. Why wouldn't they just be the same? They're in the same part of the world. Why wouldn't they be in the same? Well, there's lots of Galapagos islands. It's a group of islands, and so there's little micro environments where things are different and things had adapted. And so he was starting to figure out some of these things about adaptation. And then he came across the finches, and so he realized there were 13 different types of finches on those islands, and depending on their little microenvironment and the other finches they were competing against and the type of food they were going for, some had small beaks, some had fat beaks, some had beaks that could crush, and other ones had beaks that would like drill for insects, and other ones were getting stuff off the ground or crushing nuts. Like there were all these variations of finches, and he said they basically all derived from the basic common ground finch, but they must have adapted over time. So the finches really were a big piece of his evidence. So when he got back, that's not a picture of him at 27, by the way. But when he got back and he was 27, he reviewed his trip, bounced a lot of ideas off his brother. He published some findings, but wouldn't. He was too afraid to go all the way with his ideas at the beginning. That he would be, they were too controversial, and he would be really vilified for it. He did marry his cousin, his first cousin. Okay, so not great. They had 4 kids, and one of them ended up dying, and he blamed himself. He thought he had terrible digestion and stomach issues, and he believed he passed that to his daughter, and that children of first cousin marriages are weak, and so he blamed himself. But he also kind of pulled away from the church even more at that point because if there was a loving God, why would he take his sweet little girl away, and so and have her not live anymore? And so he really withdrew from the church even more at that point. And so he studied barnacles and other organisms and gathered more evidence, and he thought and he thought and he wrote, and he kind of had it all laid out, but he just didn't publish um, until he got a manuscript from another scientist, Alfred Wallace, who basically outlined Darwin's ideas to a T. Like, this guy had figured it out also. And so Darwin had to make a choice. He's like, either I let this guy publish it and I keep my mouth shut, or I publish now because I'm the one that figured it out first, and to establish my priority that I've had this idea for 20 years, I need to do it now. And so they actually ended up publishing a paper together, and then Darwin wrote a book. And his book is called The Origin of Species, and it's the most famous, biology book that there is. So I'm pretty sure every library would have a copy if you were interested in checking it out. It's pretty interesting. Um, so, there's a clip here for you, and I think I put a clip on the next slide, but I just kind of wanted to, let you know that that book was out there, and it's pretty interesting if you ever want to check it out. So really, the book is more about, even though it's called The Origin of Species, he does not go into the origin of man. He really doesn't talk about man in his book very much at all. It's mainly about other species. He just thought it was too controversial to go there. So a lot of people were inferring it from his book, but he just didn't want to go there. So another clip from the book, if you want to check it out. I just find that it's pretty interesting and fascinating to see how they wrote back then and what his ideas were way back then. I'll move my head over here so you can at least pause the video and read it for a second if you want to. But what he really came up with was natural selection. This is his idea of how the mechanism for evolution worked. Okay. So the first one would be the overproduction of offspring. So there had to be lots of babies. Okay. And this is an idea from Malthus. He used a lot of ideas from those pre-pioneers and he incorporated them into his ideas. And so, Malthus' idea of populations not being able to grow exponentially, well, not every baby survives, right? So your population doesn't just keep growing and growing because things keep it in check. So not every fish egg becomes a fish. Not every, dandelion seed becomes another plant. And so you you have all of this overproduction, and with overproduction comes variation. Okay, so you get variation, you get changes, and that's because DNA doesn't always copy itself correctly. You get changes, you get mutations, or if it's sexual reproduction, you get rearrangements, you get recombination, and so you definitely get changes every time you have reproduction. And so with variation, then are these organisms that may or may not succeed better. You have organisms with advantages that will do better over organisms with disadvantages, depending on what they were born with. So then you have this competition, right? You have this struggle for existence where there's winners and losers, and there's things that will outcompete other things. And so this is what you might call survival of the fittest. And I know you guys have all heard that term, survival of the fittest, maybe from Survivor, the TV show, but it's really not quite accurate for our purposes because it's not. Survival of the fittest indicates that only the biggest and strongest buck or deer in Missouri will survive. Okay, well, that's not the case, right? We have hundreds of thousands of deer in Missouri, and it's not just, the top couple that are surviving. Um, where it's survival of the fittest, it's really called survival of the fit enough, right? You have to be fit enough to survive. And so even the biggest, baddest one could be, trying to run across I-70 and get hit by a truck. I mean, it could happen. So it's really survival of the fit enough. Are you good enough to survive? And by that, I mean survive and pass on your traits, survive and reproduce, right? That's the goal. That's the idea. All of nature is just trying to survive and reproduce, pass on your traits so that the species continues. Okay, so that's the goal. And then once you have the organisms that are fit enough, this is the reproduce part, right? So survive is number 3 and reproduce is number 4. Pass it on, pass on those traits. And then number 5 is taken from Lyell, Hutton and Lyell, with uniformitarianism, small changes over large periods of time, millions of years. And so you just repeat all of these steps. And so then you have more babies, and you have variation, and then they compete, and they pass it on. And this just continues over and over and over, generation after generation. And you get these little changes, these little adaptations that end up changing things over time. And so life will adapt to survive the environment. That's the idea. So you can see our praying mantises down here that clearly they blend in with, their particular environments. If they were in the opposite environment, they probably wouldn't survive as long, right? Because they would stick out to predators. So just to look at this from, the finch point of view, pressures from the Galapagos, evolutionary pressures from the Galapagos drove beak shape, right? That's competition, that's variation. The ones that were born with certain beak shapes were surviving better, and then they get passed on. So other adaptations, color change, they could have happened at the same time. So if you look through here, you have number 1 with a small population from the mainland, and then you have random beak sizes, and then you have limited resources, so the fit enough ones that are going to survive, and then the ones that survive the best, pass on those traits. So you can kind of see the pictures going down the right-hand side and how the pictures change a little bit and how you end up with a slightly different finch going forward. So another good example of this is pesticide resistance. So we spray pesticides, at least some people do, to keep the pests down, especially in like farm fields, right? If the pests ruin your crops, you have no crops to sell. You have no food to give grocery stores for people. So you want to keep the pests down in order to, have bigger yields of your crops. So sometimes we have pesticides, and there are farmers that don't use them, right? But mainly over the past 20, 30, 40 years, lots of them have used them. And so what happens is you spray a pesticide. If you look at this graph down here, grab my, if you look at this graph, percentage of resistant mosquitoes. So in this case, we're looking at mosquitoes, and here's months, right? So it was sprayed here at month 0. So assuming 100% of mosquitoes, and then you spray, and they drop down to almost 0, but that is not 0. It's almost 0. You get rid of almost all of them. Like that would be a really noticeable difference. if we had that few mosquitoes running around our backyards, right? That would be a very noticeable difference. You could sit outside and be very comfortable. But after 2 months, you know, the number's starting to go up again. Well, why is that? Because we didn't get rid of them. And the pesticide that the mosquitoes that the pesticide didn't work on must have been resistant, right? They happened to be resistant. They got lucky. They had the genetics that allowed them to be resistant. Maybe they had a different protein that allowed them to resist the pesticide based on their genetics. And so um, now those are going to reproduce. And so if you track from 2 months to 4 months to 6 months to 8 months, back up to 12 months, in a year, 80% of the 100% are now back within a year. But the bigger problem is they are all resistant to your pesticide now. And so if you spray again, you're not going to get rid of any of these 80%. They're all resistant. Okay. So what do you have to do next? Make a new pesticide. Okay, you have to make a new one. And so now you hope that it will take care of the rest of these guys. And so if you look at this chart, 1950, 60, 70, 80, 90, 2000, somewhere between runs out between 2000 and 2010, here's cumulative number of chemicals. Well, look, in 1950 or 55-ish, okay, we got our first one. Okay, so just look at the 50 years. So from 1950, um, from 55 basically to 2000 or 2005, right in here, about 50 years. Well, we went from, no pesticides before this up to about 50. Okay, and that's about a 50-year graph. So we basically had one new pesticide per year. Well, why do we need that? Because every year there was a certain percentage of mosquitoes that were resistant to that pesticide. So what do you do the next year? You make a new pesticide and everybody comes and buys your product. And then you get rid of almost all of them, but not all of them, because there were some that were lucky enough to be resistant. Remember, they were born this way. Okay, they did not become resistant. Okay, you have to be very careful with how you say this, and the College Board people are very careful on this with questions. If you ever write that something became resistant or something became taller during their lifetime, that is not correct. That would be considered a Lamarckian statement, right, from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. That would be inheritance of acquired characteristics if an individual became resistant through its lifetime. It didn't. It was born that way. It started that way. Okay, they just got lucky. They got the mutation or they got those genetics passed to them. Okay, so they were that way the whole time. They did not become resistant. So I just wanted to kind of make that differentiation for you so that you didn't make that mistake in writing that on a question at some point. So the fundamental conclusion of natural selection is there's probably a common ancestor, right? And so if you accept the process of evolution, then logic says there was an ancient common ancestor. And you have something called tree thinking. And this is actually a sketch from Darwin's notebook showing how you can see that number one at the very bottom, meaning like that must have been the first thing. And so then you can see like the trunk of the tree and then branches branching off and how things were changing and evolving around. And if we look at this one, this is how we used to classify things. Like I saw diagrams like this all the time in high school and college. And we would look at, the groups of fish and the groups of reptiles and the groups of amphibians and mammals and stuff like that. And they were all on like their own tree branch because they were all related and they had somehow split off from ancestors earlier. And now I know you cannot read that. And now what that actually is a graph from a database where we actually track all of the DNA sequences from all of the species in the world, and we can look at how similar things are based on their genetic code, based on their genetic sequence. Things is much more computerized now. And we look at things called cladograms, which we'll get to eventually. And we'll actually use the database, hopefully, in a lab coming up. The database is called BLAST, and it's where it's where scientists put all of the genetic information. So it's accessible from anyone in the world that wants to go in and look at how things are related. And it's where we upload all of the DNA sequences and all of the protein sequences. When I was working on the Human Genome Project at WashU before I was a teacher, we were decoding DNA sequences. And so every single night we downloaded our data onto the BLAST website so that we could put, genetic sequences from chromosomes online, and people that were working on solving disease would now have that DNA sequence to work with and try and advance their problem on solving their disease. So pretty cool stuff. So common ancestor does explain a few more things. Skeletal similarities. If you look between a lot of things, the skeletons are very, very similar, and not just with things like humans and chimps and gorillas. But if you look at a lot of skeletons, if you look at your dog skeleton compared to us, it's not that different. Okay, if you look at even a dolphin or something, it wouldn't be that different from how we're organized and how all of our bones are. Also explains why you see some past and present organisms that are pretty similar. Some things evolve a lot and some things don't. I mean, armadillo in these days kind of looks like one from the past. There wasn't much need to change for them, so they've kind of survived all this time without too much change. And we're seeing more and more armadillos in Missouri. If you drive down Highway 44 to like Springfield, Missouri, you see them all over the road, or in the Ozarks and things like that. In fact, about 2 years ago, I had one of these in my yard here in O'Fallon. Like I had an armadillo. My dog chased it out of the bushes, and he just went waddling across the street. So, armadillos are pushing up from Texas and Oklahoma, and they're pushing up into Missouri now. That because it's getting warmer and they can deal with the climate up here more. Maybe we'll see. So, admittedly, I think this graph might be a few years old, so I need to probably look and see what the new one is, but it's probably not going to show too much different. But acceptance in the U.S. For the ideas of evolution. So if you look at all these countries, so the blue means the amount of people in a country that basically thinks that evolution is the way things go, and the tan color is kind of undecided, and the red is no, evolution is not the way things actually went. And so, if you look at some of these countries, it's pretty interesting to see where things are. You have the Scandinavian countries up here at the top, and you have France and Japan, pretty advanced countries. Then you have excuse me, you have the United Kingdom. They're all the way up here in the top, 6? And that's where Darwin was, and they gave him a ton of crap, when he came out with his controversial idea, and no one wanted to believe him. And now they're all the way up here. And so if you go down, mostly developed countries, you have a lot of, then you have some European, some Eastern European countries, and there's some more. And way down here, you get to the U.S. So, and the U.S. looks to be about 50-50. So that should probably say a lot as far as, what our country does with this sort of information. And over here, you can look at the percent who agree. Is a pretty interesting one too. Percent who agree that evolution is the best explanation for the origins of human life on Earth. Okay, so by religion, is this the best explanation? So Buddhist, Hindu, I think it says Jewish there, unaffiliated. Here's Catholics actually, which, that may surprise you. St. Louis is a very Catholic town, and, you're up at almost 60% of Catholics even accept that. And so, that's a pretty big number, especially given, the US number over here. And then you have the other ones that you can see, all the way down to the Jehovah's Witness that are not very much in tune with this idea. So just kind of an interesting graph for you to take a look at. So just kind of the last slide here, and it's really just kind of a thought from a scientist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, and he had this idea. There really aren't laws in biology. In chemistry and in physics, you have Boyle's law, and you have Newton's laws, and you have gas laws, and you have all these laws. In biology, we really don't. We have some theories, but we don't really have a lot of laws. And so, the idea is that natural selection is about as good as any law. Like, this is how it goes. This is how things change over time. And so a famous quote from Dobzhansky was, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And so really that's why I put the evolution unit early in the year, right after we do the biochem kind of review unit, because everything we'll talk about, we'll be able to relate back to these concepts that we're going to learn in this unit. So I think it makes sense that evolution is big idea number one for the College Board. It's the kind of thing that everything is based on. So why I moved this unit up in the year compared to some other schools, because I just think we can link a lot back to it and it'll help you guys understand things better as we go. So anyway, I hope this helped you guys, and take care. Hope things are going well.